Hey, it's Silver, and this is Atomic Heart. Oh yeah, finally here. Took me a little bit to actually get far enough to be comfortable with talking about it, but here we go. So, Atomic Heart is of course an FPS RPG, technically, set in an alternate history Soviet Russia where they made some pretty crazy advances and scientific discoveries, including actually being ready to go into space and terraform other planets and stuff. And you play as an amnesiac agent who is doing what they're told and trying to figure out what's actually going wrong in this world full of really neat robotics and stuff that are going haywire. And the first thing to talk about right out of the gate is how cool the game looks and how cool the game's style is altogether. The art style they're going for is a very colorful one that is still grounded in reality, but is still not entirely like photorealistic, you know what I mean? There's lots of very saturated bright colors and things, so it looks very striking, and a lot of the robot designs are really creative and either unsettling and weird or just really kind of fascinating. Like the one you're seeing in the background right now is a boss that's based on a hedgehog, but it's like a big sphere with crazy rocket launchers and things. It's just a really cool design, and pretty much all of the enemies in this game are designed in a similar way. There's loads of weird robotic stuff to face and also some organic stuff. You're not only fighting robots, there are also some other surprises along the way, some of which are a little bit horrifying and very difficult. But as you progress, you'll be subject to this game's structure, which is a little bit Bioshock 2-esque, as in it's got like a pseudo-open world, but it's not exactly a full-on open world game. You have these sections of more linear progression that are set in what are kind of like dungeons, really, that are, you know, like labs and theaters and stuff like that, that have a specific mode of progression where you're tied into one linear route, and they work really well because they're very well designed, and the overall map design in this game is really good, but we'll get on to that in a minute. But then outside of those more linear sections, you are let loose in an open world. Or at least what kind of seems like an open world. Actually, it's a relatively hemmed-in section of large open spaces, so they're pretty large maps, but it's not exactly one big contiguous world per se. Again, like I said, it's sort of Bioshock 2-esque, where there's a lot to see within this world, but it's also not a big empty thing for the sake of being big, which I do appreciate. And in these sort of hemmed-in open world sections, you will have a selection of different places to go from, of course, your next objective, but also you have these various things called polygons, which are basically mini dungeons. There are smaller linear sections underground in these research laboratories that are basically like puzzle-solving areas. They have a mix of logic puzzles, combat, and some other things like that to solve in order to get some optional upgrades. So there is quite a bit of non-linearity to the map itself as you go around and find all these optional bases to loot and encampments to raid full of robots and some other stuff like that. And even getting into the polygons is actually usually a puzzle in itself because each one has a different way to access it, some of which are pretty direct, like just take control of a camera and use the camera to open a special door that gives you access to it. But some of them are a lot more involved than that, like having to go into various underground sections and find power cores or having to start up various generators around the place and some stuff like that. So there's quite a bit of variety, at least to the overall exploration of the game. And when it comes down to the actual more linear sections, like the polygons or like the main story sections, I gotta say the map design is really quite good because there's a lot of variety in these sections, although visually many of them look similar. You know, a lot of the polygons have a similar Soviet research-based look to them, but of course all of the story segments do look quite a bit different, with some of them being other underground facilities, some of them being theaters that are under a lake and some other stuff like that. But overall, they managed to fill these more linear sections with a really good mix of enemy encounters, just normal patrolling enemy encounters, big set-piece battles, and puzzles and stuff to solve, as well as a lot of optional areas full of blueprints, resources, and save rooms that you can find and other stuff like that. So even in the more linear segments, there's still a lot of exploration to be had, and the map design really lends itself to something a lot like Bioshock, actually, the first Bioshock especially, in terms of just having these big open areas that are technically linear, but that still have a lot of variance in terms of what you can find in them and how you can explore them. So there are usually several ways to travel around them until, of course, you find the one intended path that you have to go to actually progress the story part. And in fact, the set piece design is one of the game's high points in my opinion, because of all of its levels, there are some really good ones with like excellent set piece combats in them that are really big, like large scale combats with awesome music. I should just mention in general that the music for this game is fantastic. It has several very talented people on the soundtrack, including of course the immortal Mick Gordon himself. And the game is really good at leveraging this soundtrack to make really memorable set piece encounters in certain areas. Like one of the ones that comes to mind for me every time is the second to last fight in the theater area, which is just awesome. It's a really fun fight with tons of like fodder enemies to cut through and some larger, more threatening enemies towards the end, and a really awesome soundtrack playing in the background the whole time. It's just a really fantastic, very memorable fight. And the game is really good at those. It's really good at taking the idea of the sort of scripted set piece encounter and running with it to make some fantastic combat encounters, especially once you get to the big important ones near the end of these linear sections. Combat-wise, it's definitely very solid. It has a noticeable focus on melee combat, even though there's a lot of ranged combat as well, but you'll be doing a lot of melee at first because you won't have very many bullets, and since you're fighting a lot of robotic enemies, they can soak up damage pretty well, so you gotta be careful about your resource expenditure. You do have a limited inventory in this game, a grid-based sort of Prey 2017 looking inventory, where all of the weapons that you're holding actually take up grids on this space, as well as all of your med kits and ammo types and stuff like that. So it does have a little bit of like MSIM DNA in it, but I wouldn't actually call it one per se. But the melee combat is actually pretty satisfying because it's got a really good sense of impact for the melee weapons. And I think it helps that you're fighting robots, so they can, really react quite heavily and come to pieces and stuff as you're smacking them around, which feels really nice. But also just the sound effects and the animations for the melee weapons are good, and they give the melee combat a good sense of impact that makes it feel nice. You also have a charged attack for each of the melee weapons, and in fact, each weapon has several different upgrades that you can equip it with. The upgrades actually change their physical appearance of the weapons, which is really cool, but also there are usually 2 different special charged attack upgrades for each weapon, so each one can do a couple of different things, which is really nice for variety. Like for instance, the Swede, which is the axe that you start the game with, has just a basic chop attack as well as a big charged power chop that does really high single target damage, but if you want, you can upgrade a different path and put a little hook on the top of the axe, which gives it a 360-degree spin attack that you can be charged up to take out large groups. But in terms of ranged weapon variety, you've also got quite a lot of that, from the basic pistol that can actually be upgraded in several different ways, to the really satisfying shotgun that tends to separate the top halves from the bottom halves of robots in a really, really nice way, to some more advanced stuff, like of course an assault rifle and some energy weapons that actually use your gloves' energy instead of bullets. They don't use ammo, so they actually have infinite ammo, but you have to wait for your energy to recharge. So you get like an electrical pistol that's very weak but very efficient. You get things like the Dominator, which is a bit like the Half-Life 2 pulse rifle. It's a rapid-fire energy weapon that can be upgraded down a couple of different paths, from like a minigun-like spool-up that does increased damage the longer you hold it, to homing projectiles, to a shotgun-like spread that uses more energy but is very powerful at close range. And you can also get some other stuff like a railgun, which is really satisfying, although it does tend to destroy enemies so completely you can't loot them, so you gotta be careful about using it. And also there's a rocket launcher, but the rocket launcher in this game is really weird because it acts more like a grenade launcher. It, normally in a video game when you fire a rocket launcher, it just flies straight forward in whatever direction you were aiming, but in this game it actually starts to arc towards the ground immediately and only reaches a pretty short range if you fire it like parallel to the ground. So if you want to fire it at a longer distance, you actually have to angle it upwards. It's a bit of an odd weapon, but it's very effective. It does a ton of damage. And of course, all of the ranged weapons do have the full upgrade system as well, with different things like sights, handles for increased accuracy and just better handling in general, extended magazines, different muzzle brakes, and other things that allow for better damage against robotic enemies or against organic enemies and things like that. So there's a lot of variety in terms of the melee and ranged weapon complements and how you can upgrade them to be fit for specific situations. You also, of course, have your glove powers. You do have some powers in this game. The basic one that you'll always get is Shock, which is actually really handy. It's just a longer, sort of medium range, like a lightning bolt. It tends to push enemies back and also does pretty respectable damage, but as you fight enemies in this game, you'll be getting a resource that you can spend on personal upgrades, as well as the more material resources that you can spend on weapon upgrades. And the personal upgrades involve just normal character stuff, like increasing your maximum health, allowing you to heal yourself with one hand so you can actually shoot and heal at the same time, upgrading your inventory capacity, things of that nature, but there's also an upgrade tree for each different power. And so you can upgrade your shock to hit at longer range, do more damage, stun enemies, chain between several enemies at once, and some other things of that nature. So you can make it really powerful, but you also have 2 other slots on Q and E that you can equip with other powers, and none of these you actually have to obtain. The game just lets you loose and allows you to get whichever ones you want at your leisure, but they're all really fun actually. But I ended up focusing on the polymer shield, which is really nice because, well, first it's a shield and you're often very heavily outnumbered, so being able to block attacks is really useful, but it also can be upgraded to return melee damage and deflect projectiles and stuff as well, so that makes it really effective in like large group encounters. And then there's also the other one I chose, which is mass telekinesis, which is really fun. You just lift everything around you up in the air and then just drop them down, but if you upgrade it enough, you can upgrade the reach that it has, so it reaches a much larger radius. You can also make it crush enemies while they're in the air, doing damage over time to them, and you can make it to where if you press the button to end it early instead of waiting for it to expire, you actually slam all the enemies down on the ground, which does a ton of damage to everything around you, so it becomes a really useful crowd control tool. So the game does have a good amount of solid mechanics, but I also have to admit that the game does have some problems with including things just for the sake of including them that don't necessarily go anywhere, right? Like a really tightly designed game has exactly everything that it needs and nothing extraneous, nothing more than that. This game has a couple of threads hanging off on a couple different sides from some stuff that doesn't quite get tied in. Like, for instance, for some reason there's like 4 different door unlocking minigames. It's kind of cool, it adds variety, but why? Like, why are there 4 different ones? Who knows? You can drive cars in the open world section. Well, there's one type of car that you can drive, a red little jalopy, and it's quite slow. It's really not that much faster than walking, and you of course have to get out of it constantly to loot stuff along the side of the road, and it's just not really that, it doesn't control that well. So why can you do it? Like, why can you drive a car? Is it because like Far Cry did it and they wanted something like that? I'm not sure, but it doesn't work very well and it's kind of pointless. There's a stealth system in the game, except not really. You can crouch, and you can sneak up on enemies, and enemies do tend to have a sort of QTE takedown that allows you to instantly kill them, but most of the time they see you, and also most of the time you're in areas with huge numbers of robots and things to where you couldn't possibly stealth kill all of them. And also, you can kind of tell it was an afterthought because none of the character upgrades relate to stealth at all. You can't like decrease your detection radius or increase your crouching walk speed or whatever, you know, all those general stealth upgrade things. There are no stealth upgrades at all, which kind of makes it seem like they just sort of tacked it on there to have it and didn't really think to integrate it into the rest of the mechanics in any meaningful way, so it just kind of hangs off there on its own, doing its own thing, and you can just sort of safely ignore it. It's a bit odd. There's also platforming in this game, but it's really not good because the air controls are terrible. Like, the overall controls of the game are fine, but in the air you have like no control over what direction you're going, and your jump is really weird in that you either jump with almost no forward momentum at all and basically just jump straight up in the air and fall straight back down, or you just throw yourself violently in one direction with absolutely zero control over where you're going. There's basically no middle ground, which means that some of the sections, especially in some of the later polygons, those optional puzzle research centers that give you weapon blueprints and stuff, some of those sections have really arduous platforming in them that just does not work very well, and it becomes extremely frustrating as a result because the platforming controls are just not up to what the game is expecting you to do with them, you know what I mean? And then there's the blueprint system, which is just kind of weird. Like, it mostly works, but when it doesn't work, it's very frustrating. Like, all of the polygons have a set blueprint in them, like several different ones, usually 4 different blueprints in each one, and for all players, they're the same. You know, you go into those polygons and you get those exact blueprints. But there are also several other blueprints that you don't get from polygons, but instead get from these chests around the world, except they're pseudo-randomized. So what I mean by pseudo is that you get the blueprints in the same order as every other player, but just because you're on, say, blueprint B and you open a chest and expect to get blueprint C, you might actually just get a duplicate of blueprint B or A instead. So some players who've been very unlucky have taken forever to get certain weapon unlocks and stuff because the blueprint chests just decided not to give them the blueprint they needed. That happened to me. Some players got the Kalashnikov, for instance, the assault rifle, like before they even hit the first open world segment of the game, whereas it took me about halfway through the game before I got it. Even though I was exploring every little nook and cranny and opening every single chest, I just kept getting duplicate blueprints instead of the next one in line, so it took me forever to get to some of the later weapons like the AK and the rocket launcher. But despite some of its eccentricities and some of its mechanics that aren't quite tied into the rest of the game as well as the others, I still think the game has really solid mechanics and is actually very fun to play. The moment-to-moment combat and exploration is really good. However, the characters and story in this game are really not very good at all. The main character is one of the most unlikable characters I have ever seen in a video game, and his sort of fighting with his glove, which is quite snarky, is just... I don't know, there's something about it. It's not all that funny most of the time, but then sometimes it loops around to being funny again, but not in the way they intended, right? It's kind of got that like Stranger of Paradise effect where the lines are so funny and the delivery is so like hilariously messed up that it loops around to being genuinely funny at times, even though it's probably in ways that it wasn't originally intended to be. But the game really backloads a couple of things. For one, you might be forgiven for thinking the game doesn't have very good enemy variety, but that's actually because the game very heavily backloads its enemy variety. There's a lot of enemies in this game actually, and some of them are really creative and fun to fight. You just won't see most of them for like the entire first half of the game, which is an odd choice. And there's also the fact that pretty much all of the character development for the very unlikable main character is very heavily backloaded. He's basically the same guy for almost the entire game, until you get to near the end stretch of the game where he sort of starts to change a little bit, but not enough to become all that likable. So I do have to say that my earlier Bioshock 2 comparison is actually even more accurate now, because Bioshock 2 was a game that had the best combat in the series, in my opinion. It had a really fun world to explore that was really well realized. It was an awesome version of Rapture to walk around in, but its narrative and its characters were nowhere near as good as the first Bioshock. You know, Bioshock 1 had some awesome moments like finding the doctor in the medical ward, or Cohen's part with all the creepy splicers that were encased in plaster. There's a lot of memorable moments like that, and I struggle to find moments like that in Bioshock 2. The gameplay was great, but the characters and the story just not so much, and this game is very much like that. It has really solid combat with very fun exploration, but the story and characters are definitely nothing to write home about. So overall, I think I'd have to say my verdict for Atomic Heart personally would be this is a game best played on Game Pass. Because on Game Pass you're not paying full price for it, but you still get to experience it, because it is a game worth experiencing. It is fun, and it does have a really cool world with some very creative ideas, but it's a bit messy in its execution. It's a little bit buggy at times with some AI and map-related glitching happening sometimes, and its story and characters are just not very good and sometimes completely laughable. So it's definitely something that I wouldn't personally pay full price for, but it is still worth experiencing if you're into like FPS or FPS RPGs. It's a really good one from a purely mechanical perspective. So there we go, that's Atomic Heart. Thank you guys very much for watching. I will, as always, of course, link you in the description below this video to the Steam store page so that you can check this game out yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.